It's a typical Tuesday afternoon at Westfield Shopping Center in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. The food court buzzes with the usual crowd of teenagers, families, and mall walkers. Security guard Sarah Chen makes her routine patrol, her badge gleaming. Under the fluorescent lights, her radio crackling with the mundane reports that fill her days. To most shoppers, she's invisible, just another uniform moving through their retail paradise. To the group of teenagers hanging out by the fountain, she's the butt of their jokes. Little do they know that in less than 24 hours, this same woman they're snickering at will literally drop from the sky to save their lives. Sarah's story isn't just about one dramatic moment. It's about the invisible heroes walking among us, the ones whose past remains hidden until circumstances force their true nature to shine. It's about prejudice, assumption, and the dangerous game we play when we judge people by their present circumstances rather than their full story. Most importantly, it's about how one woman's courage would transform an entire community's understanding of what it means to serve and protect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chen had been working security at Westfield Shopping Center for 18 months, and in that time, she'd become as much a part of the mall's furniture as the plastic plants and the information kiosks. At 42 years old, she moved through the corridors with a quiet confidence that most people mistook for timidity. Her small frame, barely 5 feet 4 inches, and her preference for keeping to herself made her an easy target for dismissal. The teenagers who spent their afternoons loitering in the common areas had long since categorized her as that Asian lady who tells us to move along. But Sarah carried herself with a precision that spoke of military training to those who knew how to look. Her uniform was always immaculate, pressed to perfection. Her boots maintained a shine that could blind you in direct sunlight. When she walked, there was no wasted motion. Every step served a purpose. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that never showed a strand out of place, and her eyes constantly scanned her environment with the systematic attention of someone trained to spot threats before they materialized. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she now spent her days preventing shoplifting and breaking up arguments between customers over parking spaces. 20 years earlier, she had been Captain Sarah Chen of the United States Army, flying Black Hawk helicopters over some of the most dangerous terrain in the world. She had commanded respect from soldiers twice her size and navigated through hostile airspace with the kind of cool precision that earned her 3 commendations for valor and a reputation as one of the finest helicopter pilots in her unit. Her transition from military service to mall security hadn't been by choice. A helicopter crash during her final deployment had left her with a traumatic brain injury that ended her flying career and a collection of physical injuries that took 2 years to heal. The doctors had assured her that her cognitive function would return to normal, but the Federal Aviation Administration had different ideas about her fitness to fly. The appeals process had drained her savings and her hope in equal measure. Sarah's husband had left during the worst of her recovery, taking their 8-year-old daughter Emma with him. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but Sarah knew the truth. He couldn't handle watching the woman he'd married, the confident pilot who could land a helicopter in a thunderstorm, struggle to remember what day it was or find her way home from the grocery store. The brain injury had been temporary, but the damage to her marriage was permanent. Now, Emma was 12 and lived 3 states away with her father and his new wife. Sarah saw her every other weekend when she could afford the plane ticket, and during those visits, she never mentioned her job. To Emma, Mommy worked in building security, a vague description that let her daughter imagine something more prestigious than the reality of confiscating stolen makeup and mediating disputes between store managers and difficult customers. The mall management had hired Sarah because she was overqualified and desperate. A Combination that meant she'd work for less than market rate and never cause trouble. They got exactly what they expected. A quiet, efficient employee who showed up on time, followed protocol, and never gave them reason to think twice about her presence. But Sarah's military training ran deeper than her uniform or her posture. She had spent years learning to read people, to identify potential threats, and to maintain situational awareness in environments where a moment's inattention could mean the difference between life and death. These skills translated surprisingly well to mall security. She could spot a shoplifter from across the food court, identify a domestic dispute before it escalated to violence, and recognize the signs of drug deals happening in the parking garage. More importantly, she had retained her pilot's instincts. Every day, she mentally cataloged the mall's layout, the emergency exits, the evacuation routes, and the fastest paths between different sections of the building. She noted which stores had the best sight lines, which corridors provided the most cover, and where someone could hide if they needed to escape quickly. It was probably overkill for a suburban shopping center, but old habits died hard. Sarah's colleagues in the security department saw her as competent, but unremarkable. She didn't join them for drinks after work or participate in their conversations about weekend plans. She completed her reports with military precision, communicated clearly over the radio, and handled difficult situations with a calm professionalism that made their jobs easier. They appreciated her reliability, but they didn't really know her. The teenagers who gathered at the mall's central fountain every afternoon had made mocking Sarah part of their daily routine. There was Jake Morrison, 17, and convinced that his father's car dealership made him royalty in their small corner of Phoenix. Madison Torres, 16, and armed with the kind of social media following that had convinced her she was destined for influencer stardom. Tyler Brooks, 15, but already sporting the attitude of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. And finally, there was Alex Kim, 14, and desperately trying to fit in with the older kids by being louder and more obnoxious than his naturally quiet personality suggested. They called Sarah Mall Cop with the kind of sneering disdain that teenagers reserve for adults they consider beneath their notice. When she'd approach their group to ask them to move along, usually because their language was disturbing other shoppers or their horseplay was getting too aggressive, they'd comply with exaggerated politeness that was somehow more insulting than outright defiance. "Of course, Officer Chen," Jake would say, emphasizing her title with mockery. "We certainly don't want to cause any trouble for someone so important." Madison would film these interactions for her social media, adding captions like, "When the power goes to their head, and imagine thinking you're a real cop." The videos never went viral, but they got enough likes and comments from their friends to encourage more of the same behavior. Tyler had once asked Sarah if she'd ever arrested anyone for real, and when she'd politely explained that mall security guards don't make arrests, he'd turned to his friends and said, "See? She's not even a real cop. She's just pretending to be important." Alex, despite his participation in the group's mockery, sometimes felt uncomfortable with how they treated Sarah. There was something about her quiet dignity that reminded him of his own grandmother, who had immigrated from Korea and worked multiple jobs to support her family, despite being treated with similar dismissiveness by people who should have known better. But peer pressure was a powerful force, and Alex was too young and too desperate to belong to risk standing up for someone the group had designated as their target. The adults who shopped at the mall were more polite but equally dismissive. They nodded at Sarah when she helped them find their lost keys or escorted them to their cars late at night, but they never really saw her as a person. She was a service, like the air conditioning or the elevator music, something that made their shopping experience more pleasant, but didn't warrant much thought. Store managers appreciated Sarah's professionalism, but they viewed her through the lens of their own retail experience. To them, she was competent loss prevention, nothing more. They had no idea that the woman who politely asked shoplifters to accompany her to the security office had once commanded a flight crew through combat missions where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. The mall's general manager, Patricia Williams, had hired Sarah 18 months earlier and considered her a success story. Sarah's background check had revealed her military service, but Patricia had focused more on her recent employment gap and her obvious need for work. She'd offered Sarah the position at a salary that was lower than what they'd typically pay someone with her education and experience, and Sarah had accepted without negotiation. Patricia interpreted this as evidence that Sarah was grateful for the opportunity and unlikely to cause problems. What Patricia didn't understand was that Sarah's willingness to take the job had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with desperation. Sarah needed health insurance for her ongoing medical care, and she needed a steady income to afford her visits with Emma. The job also provided structure and purpose at a time when she was still rebuilding her sense of identity after losing everything that had defined her for 20 years. Sarah's apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit in a complex that catered to people who were between better circumstances. The walls were bare, except for a single photograph of Emma and a folded American flag that had been presented to her during her military retirement ceremony. Her furniture was minimal: a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a television that she rarely watched. The only indication of her past life was a box in her closet containing her military commendations, her pilot's logbook, and a collection of photographs from her service years. Every morning, Sarah would wake at 05:00 hours out of habit, even though her shift didn't start until 09:00. She'd make coffee, check the weather, and review her financial situation with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to pre-flight inspections. The numbers never changed much: her rent, her car payment, her health insurance premium, and a small amount set aside for Emma's visit. There was nothing left over for luxuries or emergencies. The loneliness was the hardest part. Sarah had lost touch with most of her military friends during her recovery, partly because she'd been too proud to let them see her at her lowest point, and partly because their lives had moved on while hers had stood still. She'd tried dating a few times, but explaining her situation to potential partners was exhausting. How do you tell someone that you used to fly helicopters for the Army, but now you work mall security because your brain injury disqualified you from aviation and your divorce left you starting over at 40? Sarah's radio crackled with a report from the north entrance. A customer had locked their keys in their car and was getting increasingly agitated with the situation. Sarah acknowledged the call and began walking toward the parking lot, her mind already running through the standard protocol for lockout situations. She'd contact the customer's roadside assistance, help them stay calm while they waited, and file a report documenting the incident. As she walked, Sarah passed the fountain where the teenagers were gathering for their daily social session. She could hear Jake's voice carrying over the ambient mall noise, and she caught fragments of conversation that suggested they were planning something for the weekend. Probably a party at someone's house while their parents were out of town, judging by the excited whispers and the way they kept looking around to make sure no adults were listening. Sarah had seen enough teenage drama during her time at the mall to recognize the signs of trouble brewing. There was an energy in their group today that felt different from their usual casual hanging out, more focused, more purposeful. As a security guard, she should probably keep an eye on them. As someone who'd once been responsible for the safety of soldiers in combat, she felt a familiar tingle of concern that something was building toward a situation that might require intervention. The lockout situation in the north parking lot turned out to be more complicated than Sarah had anticipated. Mrs. Dorothy Hendricks, 73 years old and visiting from Minneapolis, had not only locked her keys in her rental car, but had also left her purse, her phone, and her medication inside. The Arizona heat was approaching 110 degrees, and Mrs. Hendricks was becoming increasingly distressed as she realized the full scope of her predicament. "I don't understand these new cars," Mrs. Hendricks was saying as Sarah approached. "Back home, I drive a 1995 Honda Civic, and I've never had a problem like this. These rental cars are too fancy for their own good." Sarah's military training had taught her that in crisis situations, the first priority was always to assess the human element. Mrs. Hendricks was showing early signs of heat exhaustion, flushed face, rapid breathing, and a slight tremor in her hands. The medication she'd mentioned was likely critical, given her age and the stress of the situation. "Ma'am, let's get you inside where it's cool first," Sarah said, gently taking Mrs. Hendricks' arm. "We can handle the car situation, but right now I'm more concerned about you." As they walked toward the mall entrance, Sarah was already mentally cataloging the resources she'd need. The mall's first aid station had cooling packs and basic medical supplies. She'd need to contact the rental car company to authorize a locksmith, and she'd have to fill out an incident report documenting the Coty situation. But her immediate concern was Mrs. Hendricks' well-being. "Have you eaten anything today?" Sarah asked as they entered the air-conditioned mall. "Just coffee this morning. I was supposed to meet my daughter for lunch, but now." Mrs. Hendricks trailed off. Looking overwhelmed, Sarah guided her to a bench near the customer service desk and radioed for her supervisor to bring a bottle of water and some crackers from the security office. Within minutes, she had Mrs. Hendricks sitting comfortably, hydrated, and with her blood sugar stabilized. The older woman's color was already returning to normal. "You're very kind, dear," Mrs. Hendricks said. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Sarah smiled. "It's my job, ma'am. But more than that, it's the right thing to do." While waiting for the locksmith, Sarah helped Mrs. Hendricks contact her daughter and arranged for a store manager to help her replace her essential items. The whole situation took 3 hours to resolve, but by the end, Mrs. Hendricks was not only safely reunited with her belongings, but had also completed her shopping and was ready to enjoy her lunch date. "You know," Mrs. Hendricks said as the locksmith finished up, "you remind me of my grandson. He's in the military army, like you were." Sarah looked surprised. "How did you know I was Army?" Mrs. Hendricks smiled. "My husband was career military. 30 years in the Air Force. You can always tell the way you handled this situation. The way you prioritized my safety over everything else. That's not something they teach in security guard training." As Mrs. Hendricks drove away, Sarah reflected on the interaction. It had been a long time since someone had recognized her military background, and longer still since someone had appreciated the skills she'd developed during her service. For a brief moment, she felt like Captain Chun again, instead of just mall security guard. The feeling didn't last long. As she walked back through the mall to resume her patrol, she passed the fountain where the teenagers were still gathered. This time, their conversation stopped abruptly when they saw her approaching. "Uh-oh," Jake said loudly enough for Sarah to hear. "Here comes the fun police again." Madison had her phone out, ready to record another interaction for her social media. "I wonder what terrible crime we're committing today. Sitting? Talking? Breathing?" Sarah could have kept walking. The teenagers weren't actually causing any problems at the moment, and she had other areas of the mall to patrol. But something about their attitude today felt different, more challenging, more deliberately provocative. Her instincts were telling her that this group was building toward something, and her experience had taught her to trust those instincts. "Good afternoon," Sarah said politely as she approached the group. "How's everyone doing today?" The teenagers exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her friendly approach. Usually, Sarah's interactions with them were limited to asking them to move along or tone down their behavior. "We're fine," Alex said, his voice less hostile than usual. "Just hanging out." "That's great," Sarah replied. "I hope you're all staying hydrated. It's pretty hot out there today." Tyler snorted. "Thanks for the weather report, mall cop, Will." Be sure to write that down. Sarah nodded calmly. I'm sure you will. Just looking out for everyone's safety. As she walked away, she could hear Madison starting to film. And there you have it, folks. The most exciting conversation you'll ever have with mall security. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling content. The mockery stung. But Sarah had endured worse during her military service. Basic training had taught her to develop thick skin, and combat deployments had shown her what real problems looked like. Teenagers making fun of her job was annoying, but it wasn't life-threatening. What bothered her more was the waste of potential she saw in these kids. Jake was clearly intelligent, despite his attitude. Madison had genuine charisma and communication skills. Tyler had the kind of natural leadership ability that could be channeled in positive directions. And Alex, despite his attempts to fit in with the group's negativity, had a thoughtful nature that suggested he was capable of real empathy. Sarah had worked with young soldiers who'd had similar attitudes when they first enlisted. The military had a way of channeling that rebellious energy into something constructive, but these teenagers didn't have that structure. They were smart, bored, and convinced that they were more sophisticated than the adults around them, a dangerous combination in any environment. As Sarah continued her patrol, she made a mental note to keep a closer eye on the group. Not because she expected them to commit any serious crimes, but because she sensed they were heading toward the kind of trouble that could have lasting consequences for their futures. And despite their treatment of her, she found herself hoping they'd make better choices than her instincts suggested they were planning. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing the day's incident reports. The lockout situation with Mrs. Hendricks had reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten, the satisfaction that came from helping people who genuinely needed assistance. It wasn't the adrenaline rush of flying combat missions, but it was meaningful in its own way. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. Dad says I can visit next weekend if you want. Can we go to that science museum you mentioned? Sarah smiled as she typed back, Of course. I'll pick you up at the airport Friday evening. Can't wait to see you. Emma's visits were the highlight of Sarah's month. At 12 years old, her daughter was beginning to develop her own interests and opinions, and Sarah treasured their conversations. Emma was fascinated by aviation and engineering, often asking detailed questions about how helicopters worked and what it had been like to fly them. Sarah had been careful never to speak negatively about Emma's father or stepmother, but she could sense that her daughter was beginning to understand that there were two sides to every story. During their last visit, Emma had asked why Sarah had stopped flying, and Sarah had given her an abbreviated version of the truth, that she'd been injured in an accident, and the doctors had said it wasn't safe for her to fly anymore. But you're better now, right? Emma had asked. Couldn't you take the test again? Sarah had explained that it was more complicated than that, but she'd promised Emma that she'd always be a pilot in her heart, even if she couldn't fly professionally anymore. It was a conversation that had left Sarah feeling both proud of her daughter's empathy and heartbroken at her own circumstances. As she prepared for bed, Sarah's mind drifted to the teenagers at the mall. There had been something in their behavior today that reminded her of the young soldiers she'd worked with during her military service. The bravado, the need to prove themselves, the way they pushed boundaries to see how far they could go before someone pushed back. In the military, that kind of behavior was channeled into training exercises and ultimately into serving their country. But these teenagers had no such outlet. They were smart, energetic, and looking for something meaningful to do with their lives, but they were stuck in a suburban mall with nothing but time and attitude. Sarah had seen what happened when that combination went wrong. During her second deployment, she'd worked with a young soldier named Marcus who'd had the same kind of intelligent rebelliousness as Jake Morrison. Marcus had been brilliant at his job, helicopter mechanic who could diagnose problems that stumped veterans with twice his experience. But he'd also been convinced that the rules didn't apply to him, that he was smarter than his superiors, and that he could get away with cutting corners. The helicopter crash that had ended Sarah's career had been caused by exactly that kind of thinking. Marcus had signed off on a maintenance inspection without actually completing it, confident that his shortcuts wouldn't matter. He'd been wrong, and the near-catastrophic failure that resulted had put Sarah's crew in mortal danger. She'd managed to land the damaged aircraft and save everyone on board, but the traumatic brain injury she'd sustained in the process had ended her flying career. Marcus had been court-martialed and discharged, but the damage was done. One young man's arrogance had destroyed multiple careers and could have killed an entire flight crew. Sarah had forgiven him years ago. She understood that he'd been young and stupid rather than malicious, but she'd never forgotten the lesson about what happened when intelligence and rebellion weren't properly channeled. The next morning, Sarah arrived at work to find the mall buzzing with excitement. Westfield Shopping Center was hosting a community event that weekend, a Heroes Day celebration honoring local first responders and military veterans. The event would include displays from the police department, the fire department, and the local National Guard unit. Patricia Williams, the mall manager, had pulled strings to get a helicopter from the National Guard to land in the parking lot as part of the display. It was a UH-60 Black Hawk, the same type of aircraft Sarah had flown during her military service. "This is going to be great for business," Patricia was telling the other security guards during the morning briefing. "We're expecting huge crowds, so everyone needs to be on their A-game. The local news is going to be here, and we want to make sure everything runs smoothly." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she looked at the photographs of the helicopter that Patricia was showing the team. She hadn't been this close to a Black Hawk since her retirement ceremony, and the sight of it brought back a flood of memories, both good and bad. "Chun, I want you covering the north section of the parking lot," Patricia said. "That's where the helicopter will be, so there's going to be a lot of crowd control needed." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She'd spent thousands of hours in aircraft like that, and now she'd be standing on the ground watching other people admire it. The irony wasn't lost on her. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself thinking about the helicopter landing. She wondered who the pilot would be, whether she'd know them from her service days, and how she'd handle being so close to the aircraft that had once been her second home. The teenagers were at the fountain again, and their conversation was louder than usual. Sarah could hear them discussing the Heroes Day event, and their comments were predictably cynical. "It's just a bunch of propaganda," Madison was saying. "They want us to think that being in the military is cool, so we'll all sign up and go fight their wars for them." "My dad says the whole thing is a waste of taxpayer money," Tyler added. "Like, we get it, you're heroes. Now stop making such a big deal about it." Jake was recording himself for social media, speaking directly to his camera. "So apparently we're supposed to be impressed by a helicopter landing in a parking lot. I mean, how hard can it be? It's not like they're landing on a moving ship or anything." Sarah paused in her patrol, listening to their conversation. She could feel her temper rising, but she forced herself to stay calm. These kids had no idea what they were talking about, but getting into an argument with them wouldn't accomplish anything positive. Alex was the only one who seemed uncomfortable with the group's dismissive attitude. "My grandfather was in Vietnam," he said quietly. "He doesn't really talk about it, but I think it was pretty rough." "That was like 50 years ago," Madison replied. "Things are different now. These days, military people just sit in air-conditioned offices and fly drones from computer screens." Sarah clenched her fists, remembering the heat of the Iraqi desert, the sound of incoming mortar fire, and the weight of responsibility she'd carried every time she'd flown a mission. But she kept walking, choosing not to engage. Friday arrived, with the kind of oppressive heat that made Phoenix summers legendary. By 10 in the morning, The temperature was already climbing toward triple digits, and the asphalt in the mall parking lot was beginning to shimmer with heat waves. Sarah had arrived early to help set up the security perimeter for the Heroes' Day event, and she was already feeling the familiar weight of anticipation that came with major events. The National Guard helicopter was scheduled to arrive at noon, and the parking lot was being cleared to create a landing zone. Sarah found herself assigned to the outer perimeter, helping to direct traffic and keep curious onlookers at a safe distance. It was routine crowd control work, but every few minutes she'd catch herself looking up at the sky, listening for the distinctive sound of rotor blades. Emma's flight was scheduled to arrive at 6 that evening, and Sarah was looking forward to bringing her daughter to see the helicopter display tomorrow. Emma had been fascinated by aviation since she was little, and Sarah had always encouraged that interest, even though it sometimes reminded her painfully of her own lost career. The first sign of trouble came at 11:30, when Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from the mall's security command center. "All units, be advised that we have a group of teenagers who have been asking detailed questions about the helicopter landing. They've been taking pictures of the security setup and asking about access points." Sarah's heart sank as she realized who the transmission was probably referring to. She keyed her radio. "This is Chen. Can you describe the group?" 4 teenagers, mixed gender, hanging out near the food court. "The manager at GameStop says they've been there for about an hour, but they're not shopping. They keep walking around and taking pictures." Sarah was already walking toward the mall entrance when her radio crackled again. "Chun, respond to the food court. Manager at Cinnabon reports that the same group was asking her about service entrances and whether the mall has roof access." The pieces were falling into place in Sarah's mind, and she didn't like the picture they were forming. The teenagers' attitude had been building toward something all week, and now they were showing unusual interest in the security arrangements for a major event. In her military experience, that combination of factors usually meant trouble. Sarah found Jake, Madison, Tyler, and Alex huddled around a table in the food court, their heads bent over Madison's phone. They looked up guiltily when they saw her approaching, which confirmed her suspicions that they were planning something they shouldn't be. "Good morning," Sarah said, keeping her voice pleasant. "I hear you've been asking questions about today's event. We're just curious," Jake said, his tone defensive. "Is that illegal now?" "Not at all," Sarah replied. "I'm curious too. What specifically are you interested in?" Madison held up her phone, showing Sarah a social media post. "We're documenting how much money the government wastes on these propaganda events. It's for a school project." Sarah glanced at the phone screen, which showed a video of the helicopter landing zone with Madison's commentary overlaid. The caption read, "Watch taxpayer money get wasted on military propaganda." Coming up, exclusive behind-the-scenes footage of the biggest waste of resources you've ever seen. "That's an interesting perspective," Sarah said carefully. "Have you considered interviewing any of the veterans who will be here today?" "Getting their side of the story?" Tyler snorted. "What are they going to say? That we should all worship them for doing their jobs?" Sarah felt that familiar tightness in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. "They might have some insights that would surprise you." "Like what?" Madison challenged. "How cool it is to drop bombs on people." The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd never dropped bombs on anyone. Her role had been search and rescue, medical evacuation, and troop transport. But she'd seen the aftermath of combat, and she'd carried wounded soldiers to safety more times than she cared to remember. The idea that her service was somehow equivalent to mindless violence was both insulting and heartbreaking. "I think you might be surprised by what military service actually involves," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "But I hope you'll be respectful during today's event. There will be families here who have lost loved ones in service to their country." Jake looked up from his phone, where he'd been typing furiously. "Don't worry, mall cop. We'll be very respectful. We wouldn't want to cause any trouble for someone so important." The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah could see Madison positioning her phone to record the interaction. This was exactly the kind of confrontation they were hoping for, an authority figure losing her temper and providing content for their social media. Sarah took a deep breath and reminded herself of her training. The best way to handle hostile civilians was to remain professional and not give them the reaction they were looking for. "I appreciate that," she said evenly. "Enjoy your afternoon." As she walked away, Sarah could hear Madison starting to record. And there you have it, folks. The mall security guard who thinks she's protecting democracy by telling teenagers to be respectful. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more hard-hitting journalism. Sarah's radio crackled again as she left the food court. "Chun, this is Williams. I need you to coordinate with the National Guard advance team when they arrive. They'll want to do a final security sweep before the helicopter lands." "Copy that," Sarah replied, grateful for the distraction. Working with the National Guard team would be a welcome change from dealing with hostile teenagers, but as she walked toward the parking lot, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Jake and his friends were planning something more than just making sarcastic social media posts. Their questions about roof access and service entrances suggested they were thinking about getting somewhere they weren't supposed to be, and their focus on the helicopter landing made her wonder if they were planning to disrupt the event somehow. In her military experience, the best way to prevent problems was to identify them early and address them before they escalated. Sarah made a mental note to keep a close eye on the teenagers throughout the day, and to make sure the National Guard team was aware of the potential for disruption. The sound of rotor blades in the distance interrupted her thoughts. Sarah looked up to see a Black Hawk helicopter approaching from the east, its dark silhouette standing out against the brilliant blue Arizona sky. For a moment, she was transported back to her military days, when that sound had meant she was about to embark on another mission. But now she was standing on the ground, watching from the outside as someone else flew the aircraft she'd once commanded. The irony was almost too much to bear. The Black Hawk touched down in the parking lot with the kind of precision that made Sarah's heart ache with longing. The pilot executed a perfect approach, accounting for the wind patterns created by the mall's architecture and the heat rising from the asphalt. It was textbook flying, and Sarah found herself mentally critiquing the approach with the eye of someone who had performed thousands of similar landings. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Rodriguez climbed out of the pilot's seat, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She recognized him immediately. They'd served together during her second deployment, and he'd been one of the few pilots whose skills had matched her own. Marcus had been a good friend and a trusted colleague, and seeing him now brought back a flood of memories from what felt like another lifetime. Marcus was talking to the National Guard advance team, pointing out various aspects of the helicopter and explaining the setup for tomorrow's display. Sarah watched from a distance, knowing that she should approach him, but uncertain how to handle the reunion. How do you greet someone who knew you when you were Captain Chun, commanding respect and flying dangerous missions, when you're now working mall security? The decision was made for her when Marcus looked up and saw her standing near the security perimeter. His face broke into a genuine smile of recognition, and he excused himself from the advance team to walk over to her. "Sarah Chen," he said, extending his hand. "I heard you were in the area, but I didn't expect to see you here." "Marcus," Sarah replied, shaking his hand with a mixture of pleasure and embarrassment. "It's good to see you. You look well." "You too," Marcus said, though Sarah could see the questions in his eyes as he took in her mall security uniform. "I heard about the accident. I'm sorry things worked out the way they did." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Marcus had been there during the investigation following her crash, and he knew the full story of what had happened and why she'd been medically retired from service. "Are you doing okay?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle. I mean, really okay? I'm managing, Sarah said, which was the truth if not the whole truth. I have a daughter to support, and this job provides stability. Marcus nodded, understanding the unspoken message that she didn't want to discuss her circumstances in detail. Well, for what it's worth, you were one of the best pilots I ever flew with. That crash wasn't your fault, and anyone who says otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. The words meant more to Sarah than Marcus could possibly know. She'd spent 2 years wondering if she could have done something differently, if her skills had failed her at a critical moment. Hearing from someone she respected that he didn't blame her for the accident was like having a weight lifted from her shoulders. Thank you, she said simply. That means a lot. Marcus glanced around the parking lot, taking in the security setup and the crowd of onlookers who had gathered to watch the helicopter. This is a nice event. The community outreach stuff is important, even if it's not as exciting as our old missions. Sarah smiled. It's different, but it has its rewards. Yesterday I helped a grandmother who was having car trouble, and she reminded me why we do this work in the first place. To serve and protect, Marcus said. Doesn't matter if it's in a combat zone or a shopping mall. Their conversation was interrupted by Patricia Williams, who approached with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had something important to discuss. Chen, Patricia said, I need you to coordinate with the National Guard team about crowd control for tomorrow. We're expecting much larger crowds than usual, and I want to make sure we're prepared. Sarah nodded. Of course, Chief Rodriguez, this is Patricia Williams, our general manager. Patricia, this is Marcus Rodriguez, the pilot who'll be doing the demonstration tomorrow. Marcus and Patricia shook hands, and Sarah could see Patricia's surprise at the easy familiarity between Sarah and the National Guard officer. It was probably the first time Patricia had seen Sarah interact with someone who clearly knew her from her military service. You two know each other? Patricia asked. We served together, Marcus explained. Sarah was one of the finest pilots in our unit. If she's handling your security, you're in excellent hands. Sarah felt a flush of pride at the compliment, but she also saw the way Patricia's expression changed as she processed this information. Sarah had never mentioned her military background in detail during her job interview, and Patricia was clearly reassessing her understanding of who Sarah was. Well, Patricia said, I'll let you two catch up. Sarah, when you're finished here, please come see me in my office. I'd like to discuss some additional responsibilities for tomorrow's event. As Patricia walked away, Marcus turned to Sarah with a questioning look. She doesn't know about your background? She knows I was in the Army, Sarah said. But I didn't see the point in going into detail about my flight experience. It's not relevant to my current job. Marcus looked like he wanted to say more, but he was interrupted by his radio crackling with a transmission from his crew chief. Chief Rodriguez, we need you back here for the pre-flight inspection. Duty calls, Marcus said. But Sarah, I want you to know that what happened to you wasn't fair. You were a hell of a pilot, and you deserved better. As Marcus walked back to the helicopter, Sarah stood watching the crew prepare for tomorrow's demonstration. The familiar sounds of pre-flight checks and mechanical adjustments brought back memories of her own crew chief, Sergeant Martinez, who had been injured in the same crash that ended her career. She wondered if he was still in the service, still working on helicopters, still dealing with the nightmares that followed them both home from their deployment. The teenagers had appeared at the edge of the parking lot, taking pictures and videos of the helicopter setup. Sarah could see Jake filming while Madison provided commentary, and Tyler and Alex were pointing at various parts of the aircraft. Their behavior seemed innocent enough, but Sarah's military training had taught her to pay attention to patterns of behavior that might indicate hostile surveillance. Sarah approached the group, keeping her expression neutral. Interesting aircraft, isn't it? Madison looked up from her phone. It's bigger than I expected. How much do you think something like that costs? The UH-60 Black Hawk has a unit cost of about $21 million, Sarah replied automatically. Then caught herself. That wasn't the kind of information a typical mall security guard would know off the top of her head. Jake looked at her with surprise. How do you know that? I read a lot, Sarah said, which was technically true. Military history is a hobby of mine. Tyler stepped closer to the security perimeter, trying to get a better view of the aircraft. Can we get closer? I want to see the inside. Not today, Sarah said. But tomorrow during the demonstration, they'll have tours available. You'll be able to see everything up close. Tours are for little kids, Madison said dismissively. We want to see the real stuff, not some sanitized presentation. Sarah felt that familiar tightness in her chest again. These kids had no idea what the real stuff actually looked like. They thought military service was all about cool equipment and exciting adventures, not about the weight of responsibility and the cost of protecting others. The real stuff, Sarah said quietly, is about serving something bigger than yourself, about being willing to put your life on the line to protect people you've never met. Alex looked at her with curiosity. You sound like you know what you're talking about. Before Sarah could respond, her radio crackled with an urgent transmission. All units, respond to the south entrance. We have a medical emergency in progress. Sarah keyed her radio. This is Chun, responding from the north lot. As she ran toward the south entrance, Sarah's mind was already shifting into emergency mode. Her military training had taught her to compartmentalize, to focus on the immediate crisis while setting aside personal concerns. The teenagers and their attitude problems would have to wait. Someone needed help, and that was her priority. Medical emergency turned out to be a heart attack. Robert Martinez, a 67-year-old veteran who had come to the mall to see the Heroes Day setup, had collapsed in the parking lot. His wife was beside him, crying and shaking, while a small crowd of onlookers stood around uncertainly. Sarah arrived at the scene to find that someone had already called 911, but the ambulance was stuck in traffic and wouldn't arrive for at least 15 minutes. Robert was conscious but in obvious distress, clutching his chest and struggling to breathe. Ma'am, I'm trained in emergency medical care, Sarah said to Robert's wife. May I help your husband? The woman nodded frantically. Please do something. I don't know what to do. Sarah knelt beside Robert, quickly assessing his condition. His pulse was rapid and irregular, his skin was pale and clammy, and he was having difficulty breathing. Classic signs of a heart attack, and potentially a serious one. Robert, can you hear me? Sarah asked, her voice calm and authoritative. I'm going to help you until the ambulance arrives. She positioned him carefully to ease his breathing, loosened his collar, and began talking to him in the steady, reassuring tone she'd used with wounded soldiers during her military service. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking his pulse, monitoring his breathing, and watching for signs that his condition was deteriorating. You're going to be okay, she told him. Help is on the way, and we're going to take good care of you. The crowd of onlookers had grown, and Sarah could see some of them recording the scene with their phones. She wanted to tell them to put their devices away and give the man some privacy, but her focus had to remain on Robert. Mrs. Martinez, what medications is your husband taking? Sarah asked while keeping her fingers on Robert's pulse. He has pills for his blood pressure and something for his cholesterol, the woman replied, her voice shaking. And he takes an aspirin every morning. The doctor said it was good for his heart, Sarah nodded. The aspirin was actually helpful in this situation, as it could reduce the risk of blood clots during a heart attack. When did he last take his medications? This morning with breakfast. We came here early to see the helicopter. Robert served in Vietnam, and he was so excited to see a Black Hawk up close. Sarah felt a pang of connection with the veteran lying in front of her. Like her, he had served his country, and like her, he was now dealing with the challenges that came after military service. The difference was that his battle was with his own body rather than with bureaucratic systems and lost careers. "Robert, I need you to stay with me," Sarah said as she noticed his breathing becoming more labored. "Tell me about Vietnam. What was your unit?" The question seemed to focus Robert's attention. "First Cavalry," he whispered. "Helicopter support. We worked with the pilots who flew the wounded out of the field." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Robert had been part of the same mission that had defined her own military career: medical evacuation and rescue operations. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She was now providing emergency medical care to a veteran who had once supported the very type of missions she had flown. "The first Cav had a great reputation," Sarah said, continuing to monitor his vital signs. "You must have saved a lot of lives." "We tried," Robert said, his voice barely audible. "Sometimes it wasn't enough." Sarah understood exactly what he meant. She'd carried wounded soldiers who didn't make it to the hospital, and she'd flown missions where she'd arrived too late to help. The weight of those experiences never fully left you, no matter how many successful rescues you completed. The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that the ambulance was finally approaching. Sarah looked up to see the crowd of onlookers had grown significantly, and she noticed the 4 teenagers from the fountain standing at the edge of the group. For once, they weren't filming or making sarcastic comments. They were watching with what appeared to be genuine concern. "The ambulance is almost here, Robert," Sarah said. "You're doing great. Just keep breathing and stay with me." The paramedics arrived with their equipment and immediately took over Robert's care. Sarah briefed them on his condition, his vital signs, and the timeline of his symptoms. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 30s with the confident manner of someone who'd seen it all, listened carefully to Sarah's report. "Good work," the paramedic said. "You kept him stable and conscious. That probably made a significant difference in his outcome." As the paramedics loaded Robert onto their gurney, he reached out and grabbed Sarah's hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "You reminded me that there are still people who care about doing the right thing." Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "Take care of yourself, Robert, and thank you for your service." Mrs. Martinez hugged Sarah before following her husband into the ambulance. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You were like an angel appearing when we needed help the most." As the ambulance pulled away, Sarah stood in the parking lot feeling emotionally drained, but also oddly satisfied. For the first time in months, she'd been able to use her military training in a meaningful way. The medical skills she'd learned during her service had made a real difference in someone's life. The crowd began to disperse, but Sarah noticed the teenagers approaching her. Jake was the first to speak, and his usual sarcastic tone was noticeably absent. "That was pretty intense," he said. "Is he going to be okay?" "I think so," Sarah replied. "The paramedics got here quickly, and he was stable when they left. That's a good sign." Madison was looking at Sarah with a new expression, something that might have been respect. "You really knew what you were doing. Where did you learn all that medical stuff?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I had medical training in the Army, basic field medicine and emergency response." Tyler stepped forward. "My mom's a nurse, and she says that most people panic in situations like that. But you were totally calm, like you'd done it before." "Training takes over," Sarah said simply. "When someone needs help, you focus on what needs to be done." Alex was the last to speak. "That guy said he worked with helicopter pilots in Vietnam. Did you know pilots when you were in the Army?" The question caught Sarah off guard. "I knew some pilots," she said, which was technically true. She'd known herself, after all. The teenagers exchanged glances, and Sarah could see them processing what they'd witnessed. For the first time since she'd started working at the mall, they seemed to be seeing her as something more than just the mall cop who tells them what to do. "We should probably get going," Jake said, but his tone lacked its usual dismissive edge. "Thanks for helping that guy. That was really cool of you." As the teenagers walked away, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn the day had taken. She'd then prepared for crowd control and routine security duties, but she'd ended up providing emergency medical care to a fellow veteran. The experience had reminded her that her military training wasn't just a part of her past, it was a set of skills that could still make a difference in civilian life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from Patricia Williams. "Chun, please report to my office when you're available. I'd like to discuss what just happened." Sarah keyed her radio. "On my way." As she walked toward the mall entrance, Sarah wondered what Patricia wanted to discuss. The medical emergency had been handled professionally, and the victim had received appropriate care. But she had a feeling that Patricia's questions would go beyond the immediate incident. The mall manager's office was located on the second floor, overlooking the main concourse. Patricia was waiting for her with a serious expression and a cup of coffee that had clearly been sitting untouched for some time. "Have a seat, Sarah," Patricia said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "I want to talk about what happened out there." Sarah sat down across from Patricia, trying to read her manager's expression. Patricia had always been professional, but distant in their interactions, treating Sarah as a competent but unremarkable employee. Now there was something different in her demeanor, a combination of curiosity and what might have been newfound respect. "I watched the security footage of what happened in the parking lot," Patricia said, leaning forward in her chair. "Your response to that medical emergency was impressive. The paramedic said you probably saved that man's life." "I just did what needed to be done," Sarah replied. "Anyone with basic medical training would have responded the same way." Patricia shook her head. "That's not true, and you know it. Most people would have panicked or frozen up. You took control of the situation immediately and knew exactly what to do. That's not basic training, that's advanced medical experience." Sarah remained silent, unsure where this conversation was heading. "When I hired you 18 months ago," Patricia continued, "your resume listed military service, but you were vague about the details. I assumed you'd been in a support role, administration, logistics, something like that. But watching you today and seeing how you interacted with that National Guard pilot, I'm starting to think there's more to your background than you've let on." Patricia pulled out a folder from her desk drawer and opened it. Sarah recognized it as her personnel file. "I made some phone calls this afternoon," Patricia said. "I have a brother-in-law who works in military records, and I asked him to look into your service history. What I found was ... enlightening." Sarah felt her heart sink. She'd been hoping to avoid this conversation indefinitely. "Captain Sarah Chen," Patricia read from a document in the folder. 20 years of service, including 3 combat deployments. Flight qualified on multiple aircraft types, including the UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter. Recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with Combat V, and the Bronze Star. Medically retired following injuries sustained in a helicopter crash while evacuating wounded personnel. Patricia looked up from the file. "You were a helicopter pilot. Not just any pilot according to these records. You were one of the most decorated pilots in your unit." Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, I was. And you didn't think to mention this when you applied for a job in mall security?" "It wasn't relevant to the position," Sarah said, which was the same explanation she'd given herself for the past 18 months. Patricia leaned back in her chair. "Sarah, you have skills and experience that this mall could use in ways you can't imagine. Why are you working security for $12 an hour when you could be doing something that actually matches your qualifications?" It was a fair question, and one that Sarah had been avoiding for months. The truth was complicated and painful, involving medical restrictions, lost confidence, and the practical realities of starting over in her 40s. "The helicopter crash left me with a traumatic brain injury," Sarah said quietly. "I lost my medical certification to fly, and the FAA won't reinstate it. My marriage fell apart during my recovery, and I lost custody of my daughter. I needed a job that would provide health insurance and a steady income, and this position offered both." Patricia's expression softened. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize how difficult things had been for you." "I don't need sympathy," Sarah said quickly. "I just need to do my job and provide for my daughter." "But you're wasting your talents," Patricia insisted. "You could be doing security consulting, training programs, emergency response coordination. There are so many ways you could use your military experience." Sarah had heard similar suggestions from well-meaning people before, but they didn't understand the practical obstacles she faced. Her medical restrictions limited her employment options. Her divorce had left her with damaged credit, and her confidence had been shattered by the crash and its aftermath. "Maybe someday," Sarah said diplomatically. "But right now, this job works." "For me," Patricia nodded, but Sarah could see that she wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. "Well, regardless of your reasons for being here, I want you to know that I have a new appreciation for what you bring to this team. Your actions today probably saved a man's life, and that reflects well on all of us." As Sarah left Patricia's office, she felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She was glad that her manager now had a better understanding of her background, but she was also worried about the increased attention and expectations that might come with it. The mall was beginning to fill with the evening shopping crowd, and Sarah resumed her patrol duties. As she walked through the concourse, she noticed that several store employees nodded at her with what seemed like newfound respect. Word had apparently spread about the medical emergency and her role in helping the veteran. The teenagers were back at the fountain, but their behavior seemed different. Instead of the usual loud conversations and disruptive antics, they were sitting quietly and talking in low voices. When Sarah approached, they looked up at her with expressions that were free of their usual mockery. "How's that guy doing?" Alex asked, "the one who had the heart attack." "I called the hospital," Sarah said. "He's stable and expected to make a full recovery." "That's good," Madison said. "It was scary watching him collapse like that." Sarah was surprised by the genuine concern in the girl's voice. It was a serious situation, but he got the help he needed in time. Tyler was looking at her with curiosity. "You really were in the Army, weren't you? Like, really in the Army? Not just doing paperwork or whatever?" "Yes, I was," Sarah confirmed. "For 20 years. Jake leaned forward. "What did you do? I mean, what was your job?" Sarah hesitated, then decided that after Patricia's investigation, there was no point in being evasive. "I was a pilot. I flew helicopters." The teenagers exchanged glances of surprise and what might have been embarrassment. For months, they'd been mocking someone who had literally risked her life in service to her country. "Like that helicopter in the parking lot?" Tyler asked. "Yes, exactly like that one." There was a moment of uncomfortable silence as the teenagers processed this information. Sarah could see them reassessing their understanding of who she was and what she'd done with her life. "Why are you working here?" Madison asked. "I mean, if you were a pilot, shouldn't you be doing something more important?" It was an innocent question, but it cut to the heart of Sarah's current struggles. How do you explain to a teenager that life doesn't always work out the way you plan, that circumstances beyond your control can derail your career and force you to start over? "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns," Sarah said diplomatically. "The important thing is to make the best of whatever situation you find yourself in." The conversation with the teenagers was interrupted by Sarah's radio crackling with an urgent transmission. All units, We have a code red situation developing at the downtown Phoenix Medical Center. Mass casualty incident in progress. All available emergency personnel are being diverted to assist. Sarah felt her blood run cold. A code red at the medical center meant a major emergency, possibly a building collapse, a terrorist attack, or a natural disaster. The fact that they were calling for all available personnel suggested that the situation was overwhelming the normal emergency response capacity. Her radio crackled again. "Chen, this is Williams. The National Guard unit is being activated to assist with the emergency downtown. They're requesting immediate departure, but they have a problem." Sarah keyed her radio. "What kind of problem?" "The pilot is experiencing symptoms of food poisoning. He's in no condition to fly, and their backup pilot is already deployed on another mission. They need someone who can fly that helicopter immediately." Sarah's heart began to race. She knew where this conversation was heading, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. "Patricia, I can't," Sarah began. "Sarah," Patricia's voice cut through her objection, "there are people downtown who need help, and you're the only qualified pilot available. I know about your medical restrictions, but this is an emergency." The teenagers had been listening to the radio transmissions, and they were looking at Sarah with expressions of growing understanding. The pieces were falling into place for them. The military background, the medical training, the calm competence they'd witnessed during the heart attack incident. "You can fly that helicopter," Jake said, his voice filled with amazement. "You're not just a security guard, you're a real pilot." Sarah looked at the four teenagers, seeing them clearly for the first time. They weren't just obnoxious kids making fun of her, they were young people who had been searching for something meaningful to believe in, and they'd been dismissing her because they couldn't see past her current circumstances. "I was a pilot," Sarah said quietly, "but I haven't flown in 2 years. My medical certification was revoked after my accident." "But you still know how to fly, right?" Madison asked. "It's not like you forget how to do something like that." Sarah's radio crackled. Again. "Chen, Chief Rodriguez is requesting to speak with you directly. He says it's urgent." Sarah walked away from the teenagers and keyed her radio. "Rodriguez, this is Chen. Go ahead." "Sarah, I need you to listen to me," Marcus's voice came through the radio. "I know about your medical restrictions, and I know you're scared. But there's been a building collapse at the medical center, and we have injured people trapped under debris. The local hospital is overwhelmed, and they need our helicopter to transport critical patients to trauma centers in other cities." Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This was exactly the kind of mission she'd flown countless times during her military service, medical evacuation of critically injured people who would die without immediate transport to appropriate facilities. "Marcus, I can't legally fly that aircraft," Sarah said. "My medical certification." "This is an emergency situation," Marcus interrupted. "Federal regulations allow for emergency operation by qualified personnel when lives are at stake. I'm the mission commander, and I'm authorizing you to fly this mission." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the pull of her old life and the fear of her new limitations warring in her mind. She'd spent 2 years telling herself that she was done with flying, that she was better off staying on the ground where she couldn't hurt anyone. But people were dying downtown, and she was the only one available who could help. "What about my passenger?" Sarah asked. "I'd need a crew chief and a medic." "I'll fly as your crew chief," Marcus said. "And we have a flight medic from the National Guard unit who's ready to go." "Sarah, I've flown with you before. I know you can do this." Sarah looked back at the teenagers who were watching her with rapt attention. For months, they'd seen her as an authority figure to rebel against, but now they were looking at her as someone who might actually be worthy of respect. "If you don't go," Alex said quietly, "people are going to die, aren't they?" Sarah nodded. "Probably." "Then you have to go," Tyler said. You're the only one who can help them. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. These teenagers who had spent months mocking her were now encouraging her to risk everything to help people they'd never met. Their faith in her was both humbling and empowering. I haven't flown in 2 years, Sarah said, as much to herself as to the teenagers. What if I've lost my edge? What if I make a mistake? You won't, Madison said with surprising confidence. You saved that man's life today without even thinking about it. Flying is just another way to save people. Sarah's radio crackled with another transmission. Shun, this is Williams. The media is starting to arrive at the medical center. This is going to be a high-profile situation. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Sarah thought about the implications of what Patricia was asking. If she flew this mission, her story would inevitably come out. The mall security guard, who had once been a decorated military pilot, would become a news story, and her carefully constructed privacy would be shattered. But as she looked at the teenagers, particularly at Alex, who was watching her with the kind of hope she hadn't seen in someone's eyes in years, Sarah realized that some things were more important than privacy. I'm prepared, Sarah said into her radio. But I need 5 minutes to make a phone call. She walked away from the group and dialed Emma's number. Her daughter answered on the second ring. Mom, I thought you were picking me up at the airport. Tonight. Emma, I need to tell you something important, Sarah said. There's been an emergency, and I've been asked to fly a helicopter to help injured people. I might be late picking you up. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Mom, you're going to fly again. Yes, sweetheart. Just this once. Are you scared? Sarah considered the question. Yes, I am. But sometimes being scared doesn't matter when people need help. I'm proud of you, Mom, Emma said. I always have been. As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. She was about to risk everything: her safety, her privacy, her carefully constructed new life, but she was doing it for the right reasons. Sarah walked back toward the helicopter, her mind automatically shifting into pre-flight mode. It was remarkable how quickly the mental routines returned, the systematic thinking, the prioritization of tasks, the calm focus that had served her well during countless missions. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed this feeling of purposeful competence. The teenagers followed her toward the Black Hawk, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly fascinated by the transformation they were witnessing. Sarah was no longer the quiet mall security guard they'd been mocking for months. She was moving with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. Marcus was waiting by the aircraft with Sergeant First Class Jennifer Walsh, the flight medic who would be accompanying them on the prejudice mission. Walsh was a compact woman in her 30s with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that Sarah remembered from her own military service. Captain Chen, Walsh said, extending her hand. I've heard a lot about you from Chief Rodriguez. It's an honor to fly with you. Sarah shook her hand, noting that Walsh had addressed her by her former rank rather than her current civilian title. It was a small gesture, but it meant something important: recognition that her military identity was still valid, even if her medical certification had been revoked. The honor's mine, Sergeant Walsh, Sarah replied. What's the current situation? Downtown? Walsh consulted her notes. We have a 6-story medical office building that partially collapsed about 30 minutes ago. Initial reports suggest that a gas explosion in the basement caused structural damage that brought down the eastern wing. We've got multiple casualties, with at least 12 people trapped under debris. Sarah nodded, her mind already working through the logistics of the mission. What's our destination for patient transport? Primary trauma center is Phoenix General, but they're at capacity, Marcus said. We'll be transporting critical patients to facilities in Tucson and Flagstaff. Flight time to Tucson is about 45 minutes. Flagstaff is about an hour. Sarah was running through mental calculations: fuel capacity, patient load, medical equipment requirements. It was like riding a bicycle. The knowledge was still there, waiting to be accessed. "How many patients are we looking at?" Sarah asked. "Unknown at this time," Walsh replied. "But the incident commander is requesting immediate helicopter support for critical transports. Ground ambulances are handling the less serious injuries." Sarah approached the Black Hawk and began her pre-flight inspection. Her hands moved automatically, checking control surfaces, examining the rotor system, inspecting the engine compartments. It was a ritual that had been ingrained in her through thousands of hours of flight training and operational experience the teenagers were watching from the security perimeter, and Sarah could see other mall employees and shoppers gathering to observe the unusual scene. Patricia Williams was speaking with someone on her phone, probably updating her superiors about the situation and the potential liability of allowing a mall security guard to fly an emergency mission. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly, "are you sure about this? I know what this helicopter means to you, and I know what happened during your last flight. If you're not ready—" "I'm ready," Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "People need help, and I'm the only one available who can provide it." Marcus smiled. "That's the Captain Chun I remember." Sarah completed her external inspection and climbed into the pilot's seat. The cockpit was exactly as she remembered: the familiar arrangement of instruments, the comfortable weight of the flight controls, the sense of being in command of a powerful machine designed to save lives. She began the engine start sequence, her hands moving across the controls with practiced precision. The turbine engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and the rotor system began to turn. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline and nostalgia as the helicopter came alive around her. "Phoenix Control, this is Army 217, requesting immediate departure for medical evacuation mission," Sarah transmitted on the radio. "Army 217, this is Phoenix Control. You are cleared for immediate departure. Emergency corridor is established. Proceed direct to Phoenix Medical Center." Sarah increased power and lifted the Black Hawk into the air. For a moment, she felt dizzy with the sensation of flight after 2 years on the ground. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by the familiar confidence that came with being in her element. As they climbed away from the mall, Sarah looked down at the parking lot where she'd spent the last 18 months walking security patrols. The teenagers were still there, watching the helicopter depart, and Sarah wondered what they were thinking. Were they proud of her, impressed by her hidden abilities? Or were they just amazed that someone they'd dismissed so casually had turned out to be capable of something extraordinary? "Looking good, Sarah," Marcus said over the intercom. "You haven't lost your touch." Sarah smiled as she banked the helicopter toward downtown Phoenix. "It's like riding a bicycle. A very expensive, very complicated bicycle." The flight to the medical center took only 10 minutes, but it felt like both an eternity and an instant. Sarah was hyper-aware of every sensation: the vibration of the rotor system, the response of the controls, the view of the city passing beneath them. She was also acutely conscious of the fact that this might be her last flight, depending on how the mission went and what consequences she faced afterward. As they approached the medical center, Sarah could see the extent of the damage. The eastern wing of the 6-story building had indeed collapsed, leaving a pile of concrete and steel that was swarming with rescue workers. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars filled the surrounding streets, and Sarah could see news helicopters circling at a safe distance. "Army 217, this is Phoenix Fire Department Incident Command," a voice crackled over the radio. "We have a landing zone established in the parking lot south of the main building. Be advised, we have critical patients ready for immediate transport." "Copy, Incident Command. Army 217 is inbound for landing." Sarah brought the Black Hawk into a hover over the designated landing zone and began her descent. The parking lot was filled with emergency vehicles and personnel, but a clear area had been marked out for the helicopter. Sarah's military training kicked in as she assessed the wind conditions, the obstacles, and the people on the ground. "Nice approach," Marcus commented, "just like old times." But as Sarah flared the helicopter for landing, she felt a moment of uncertainty. What if her medical condition affected her flying? What if she made a mistake that put people in danger? What if she wasn't the pilot she used to be? The doubts lasted only a second before being overwhelmed by her sense of purpose. People were counting on her, and she wouldn't let them down. She settled the Black Hawk onto the parking lot with the kind of smooth precision that comes from years of experience and thousands of hours of practice. "Touchdown," Sarah announced. "We're on the ground and ready for patience." After completing her 7th rescue flight of the day, Sarah finally shut down the Black Hawk's engines. The sun was setting over Phoenix, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and the immediate crisis at the medical center had been resolved. 12 patients had been successfully evacuated to trauma centers across Arizona, and every single person who had been trapped in the collapsed building had been rescued alive. As Sarah climbed out of the pilot's seat, she felt a profound sense of exhaustion mixed with exhilaration. Her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, and her uniform was soaked with sweat from the physical and emotional intensity of the day. But she also felt more alive than she had in 2 years. Marcus appeared at her side, carrying 2 bottles of water and wearing the kind of grin that she remembered from their military days. "Sarah, that was some of the finest flying I've ever seen. 7 flights, 12 patients, 0 complications. You haven't lost a step." "It felt good to be back," Sarah admitted, accepting the water gratefully. "Really good." Sergeant Walsh approached with the final mission report. "Captain Chen, I've been doing medical evacuations for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did today. Your flying was textbook perfect, but more than that, you made every patient feel safe. I could see it in their faces when you talked to them over the intercom." Sarah felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the Arizona heat. During her military service, she had often focused on the technical aspects of flying, the precision, the skills, the mission requirements. But today had reminded her of the human element, the fact that every flight was about people who were counting on her to get them to safety. "Thank you, Sergeant. But we all did our jobs today. This was a team effort." As they walked toward the staging area where the media had gathered, Sarah noticed a commotion near the edge of the parking lot. A group of people were pushing through the crowd of reporters and emergency personnel, and she could hear someone calling her name. "Sarah, Sarah Chen." She turned to see a sight that made her heart skip a beat. Emma was running toward her, followed by David, her ex-husband, and several other people she didn't immediately recognize. Emma threw herself into Sarah's arms, and for a moment, everything else faded away. "Mom, I saw you on the news," Emma said, her voice muffled against Sarah's shoulder. "Dad was watching TV at his office, and they said a mall security guard was flying helicopters to save people. I told him it had to be you, but he said that was impossible. Then they showed your picture, and he brought me straight here." Sarah looked over Emma's head at David, who was standing awkwardly a few feet away. Her ex-husband's expression was complex, part amazement, part guilt, and part something that might have been respect. "Hello, Sarah," David said quietly. I had no idea. When we got divorced, I thought you were just going through a rough patch. I didn't understand that you were dealing with something this significant." Sarah felt a mixture of emotions toward her ex-husband: anger for his abandonment during her darkest time, sadness for what their marriage had once been, and a strange sense of closure. "I was dealing with a lot of things, David. The important thing is that Emma is happy and healthy." "About that," David said, his voice uncertain, I think we need to talk about the custody arrangement. Emma has been asking to spend more time with you, and after seeing what you've accomplished today, I think she's right. You're clearly in a much better place than when we made the original agreement. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. The custody arrangement had been one of the most painful aspects of her divorce, and the thought of having Emma back in her life more regularly was almost overwhelming. We can discuss it, Sarah said carefully. But right now I just want to hold my daughter. As they stood there embracing, Sarah became aware that the media attention was intensifying. News crews were setting up for live broadcasts, and she could see reporters interviewing other people involved in the rescue operation. Her story was becoming public in a way that would change her life forever. "Mom," Emma said, pulling back to look at her. "Are you ready for all this attention?" "They're saying you're a hero." Sarah considered the question. For 2 years, she had been invisible, dismissed, and underestimated. The idea of being thrust into the public eye was both terrifying and liberating. But she realized that the attention wasn't really about her. It was about the larger story of service, resilience, and the importance of not giving up on yourself or others. "I'm ready," Sarah said, surprised by her own certainty. "But I want you to understand something, Emma. What I did today wasn't about being a hero. It was about using the skills and experience I have to help people who needed help. That's what service means, being ready to act when others need you." Emma nodded. "Seriously, I understand, Mom, and I'm proud of you. Not just for today, but for everything you've been through and how you've handled it." As they walked toward the media area, Sarah noticed 4 familiar figures standing at the edge of the crowd. Jake, Madison, Tyler, and Alex had somehow made their way to the medical center, and they were watching her approach with expressions of awe and what looked like genuine respect. For the first time in months, Sarah felt truly seen, not as a mall security guard to be mocked, not as a broken veteran to be pitied, but as a person who had faced challenges and found a way to turn them into strength. The teenagers who had dismissed her were now looking at her with the kind of admiration she had once taken for granted during her military service. But more importantly, she was looking at herself with renewed respect. She was still Captain Sarah Chen, helicopter pilot and servant of others. She had never really stopped being that person. She had just forgotten for a while. As Sarah walked away from the media interviews and the crowd of onlookers, she felt the weight of what had just happened settling on her shoulders. The adrenaline from the rescue flights was wearing off, replaced by a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that she remembered from her military days. But this was different. She was no longer Captain Chen leading a mission. She was Sarah Chen, mall security guard, who had just stepped back into her old life for one extraordinary day. Emma was still holding her hand as they walked toward David's car, chattering excitedly about what she had witnessed. "Mom, everyone is talking about you. The reporters, the other people. Everyone wants to know about the helicopter pilot who was working at the mall. Are you going to be on TV?" Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. "Probably, sweetheart. But I want you to understand something important. What happened today doesn't change who I am. I'm still your mom, and I'm still the same person who's been working security at the mall for the past 18 months. But you're not the same person," Emma said, with the directness that only children possess. "You're different now. You're like yourself again." The observation hit Sarah harder than she expected. Emma was right. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah felt like herself again. The confident, competent pilot who had saved lives and commanded respect hadn't disappeared. She had just been buried under circumstances and self-doubt. David approached them hesitantly, his expression a mixture of shame and newfound respect. "Sarah, I owe you more than an apology. When we divorced, I convinced myself that you had become someone different, someone diminished. But watching you today, I realized the truth. You never changed. I just stopped seeing who you really were because I was too scared to handle your struggles. Sarah looked at her ex-husband, feeling a complex swirl of emotions. Anger at his abandonment when she needed him most, sadness for what their marriage had once been, but also a strange sense of closure. David, we both made mistakes. What matters now is Emma and making sure she knows she's supported. I want to discuss the custody arrangement, David said quietly. Emma should be with you more. She needs to see her mother succeed, and clearly you're in a position to provide that now. Before Sarah could respond, her phone began buzzing with notifications. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails, all from numbers she didn't recognize. The story was spreading faster than she had imagined possible. The first message was from Patricia Williams. Sarah, we need to talk immediately. Can you come to my office first thing tomorrow? This changes everything about your position here. Another was from Marcus. Sarah, what you did today reminded me why I became a pilot in the first place. I know someone who's starting a medical evacuation service. They need someone with your experience. Are you interested in hearing more? Then came a voicemail from a number with a Washington, D.C. area code. Ms. Chen, this is Dr. Margaret Foster from the FAA Medical Review Board. I've been following the news coverage of your rescue mission. Your performance today raises questions about your current medical certification status. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss potential reinstatement. Please call me at your earliest convenience. Sarah stared at her phone, overwhelmed. In the span of a few hours, her entire world had shifted. The doors that had been slammed shut after her accident were suddenly creaking open again. Mom, you look scared, Emma observed with typical teenage bluntness. I'm not scared, sweetheart. I'm just processing. This morning I was a mall security guard that teenagers made fun of. Tonight I'm getting calls from the FAA and job offers from aviation companies. It's a lot to take in. Emma squeezed her mother's hand. You know what I think? I think you were always ready for this. You just needed the right moment to show everyone else what I already knew, that you're still the amazing pilot who used to tell me bedtime stories about flying through clouds. As they reached David's car, Sarah turned to take one last look at the medical center where everything had changed. The helicopter was gone, the crowds were dispersing, and the emergency was over. But the ripples of what had happened would continue spreading outward, touching lives in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Sarah, David said as he opened the car door for Emma, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but would you consider having dinner with us this week? I'd like Emma to hear some of your military stories. The real ones, not the sanitized versions I used to tell her. Sarah nodded, surprised by the request. I'd like that. Emma should know about that part of my life. As they drove towards Sarah's apartment, she reflected on the strange symmetry of the day. She had started it as someone dismissed and overlooked, and she was ending it as someone whose story was spreading across the country. But the most important change wasn't external, it was the restoration of her own sense of who she was and what she was capable of. The teenagers who had mocked her at the fountain had inadvertently done her a favor. Their dismissal had served as a daily reminder that she was capable of more than her circumstances suggested. In some ways, their mockery had been the catalyst she needed to push herself when the opportunity arose. Back in her small apartment, Sarah sat with Emma on the couch, both of them still processing the day's events. The space felt different now, smaller, as if the walls couldn't contain the possibilities that had suddenly opened up. What happens now, Mom? Emma asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. I don't know exactly, but I learned something important today. I'm still the pilot I always was. I just forgot that for a while. Are you going to keep working at the mall? We'll see what opportunities come our way. But Emma, I want you to remember something. What I did today wasn't about proving anything to the people who dismissed me. It was about using my skills to help people who needed help. That's what service really means. As Emma curled up beside her, Sarah looked around her modest apartment and thought about the future. The job offers, the media attention, the possibility of restored medical certification, all of it was both exciting and terrifying. Her phone buzzed again. Another opportunity, another door opening. Sarah looked at Emma, peaceful and trusting beside her, and smiled. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. The mall security guard who had been mocked by teenagers was about to become whoever she needed to be next, armed with the knowledge that heroism wasn't about the uniform you wore, but about the choices you made when someone needed help. Sarah's decision to accept the position with Desert Sky Aviation came after a sleepless night of weighing her options. The startup medical evacuation service offered her exactly what she had been hoping for, a chance to build something meaningful from the ground up, using her military experience to create a program that would save lives across the Southwest. The FAA medical evaluation had taken place 2 weeks after the rescue, and the results exceeded even Sarah's most optimistic expectations. Dr. Margaret Foster had personally delivered the news. "Captain Chen, I'm pleased to inform you that your medical certification has been fully restored. Your cognitive function shows no impairment, your reflexes are excellent, and your flight skills are clearly intact. You're cleared for unrestricted commercial flying." The certification restoration had been the final piece of the puzzle. With her medical clearance, her demonstrated competence, and her growing reputation, Sarah was positioned to return to meaningful aviation work for the first time since her accident. Desert Sky Aviation was more than just a job, it was a mission. The company had been founded by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, an emergency physician who had seen too many patients die because they couldn't be transported quickly enough to appropriate medical facilities. The rural areas of Arizona and New Mexico were underserved by traditional emergency medical services, and helicopter transport could mean the difference between life and death for people living hours away from major medical centers. "We need someone who understands both the aviation and medical sides of this work," Dr. Rodriguez had explained during Sarah's interview. "Your military experience with medical evacuations, combined with your recent demonstration of crisis management skills, makes you the perfect candidate to build our flight operations from scratch." Sarah's first month at Desert Sky had been a whirlwind of activity. She had to hire and train pilots, establish maintenance protocols, coordinate with hospitals across 2 states, and create operational procedures that would ensure both safety and efficiency. It was exactly the kind of challenge that had always energized her during her military service. The aircraft were state-of-the-art, 2 Eurocopter EC-145 helicopters equipped with advanced medical equipment and configured for critical care transport. Sarah had worked with the medical team to optimize the interior layout, drawing on her experience with military medical evacuations to create a setup that maximized both patient care capabilities and crew safety. Marcus had joined the team as senior pilot, bringing his own experience and a working relationship with Sarah that made the aviation side of the operation run smoothly. Their professional partnership had naturally evolved into something deeper, and they had begun discussing the possibility of a future together once the company was established. "You know," Marcus said as they completed their 3rd successful mission of the day, "I never imagined when I saw you at the mall, that helicopter, that we'd end up working together again. It's like everything came full circle." Sarah smiled as she guided the helicopter back to their base. "I think everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to. The time I spent at the mall taught me things about patience and humility that I needed to learn. I'm a better pilot and a better person because of that experience." The missions were challenging and rewarding in equal measure. Sarah had flown heart attack victims from remote ranches to cardiac centers, transported car accident victims from mountain highways to trauma hospitals, and evacuated patients from small-town hospitals to specialized facilities. Each flight reminded her of why she had chosen aviation in the first place, the ability to compress time and distance. When someone's life hung in the balance, one particular mission had stayed with her. A 6-year-old girl had been severely injured in a playground accident at a small school in rural New Mexico. The local hospital lacked the pediatric trauma capabilities she needed, and the nearest children's hospital was 3 hours away by ground ambulance. Sarah had flown the mission personally, transporting the child and her terrified mother to Albuquerque in 45 minutes. "Thank you for saving my daughter," the mother had whispered as they transferred the girl to the pediatric trauma team. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Sarah had watched the child being wheeled into surgery, thinking about Emma and about all the parents who had trusted her with their most precious cargo during her military service. This was why she flew not for the adrenaline or the technology, but for moments like these when aviation made the difference between hope and despair. The media attention from the medical center rescue had continued to follow Sarah, but she had learned to use it constructively. She had appeared on several television programs discussing veteran employment issues and the importance of looking beyond someone's current circumstances to see their potential. Her story had become a symbol of resilience and second chances, inspiring people across the country who were facing their own challenges. One interview had particularly resonated with her. A young veteran named David Martinez had written to her after seeing her on the news. He had been struggling with PTSD and unemployment since his discharge from the Marines, and he had been feeling hopeless about his future. "Your story showed me that setbacks don't have to be permanent," he wrote. "If you can come back from a traumatic brain injury and rebuild your career, maybe I can find a way to overcome my challenges too." Sarah had responded personally to his letter, offering encouragement and practical advice about veteran resources and employment opportunities. She had also connected him with other veterans who had successfully transitioned to civilian careers, helping to build a network of support that extended far beyond her own experience. The 4 teenagers from the mall had also remained in touch, and their transformation had been remarkable. Jake had thrown himself into his studies and had been accepted to the Air Force Academy, inspired by Sarah's example to pursue a career in military aviation. Madison had used her social media platform to create a documentary about veteran employment issues featuring Sarah's story as the centerpiece. Tyler had joined the Civil Air Patrol and was training to become a search and rescue pilot. Alex had begun volunteering at the VA hospital, helping veterans navigate the healthcare system. Their change from cynical teenagers to engaged citizens had become almost as famous as Sarah's own story. They had appeared together on several talk shows, discussing the importance of not judging people by their circumstances and the power of positive role models to inspire change. "You saved more than just those people at the medical center," Madison had said during one interview. "You saved us from becoming the kind of people who never look beyond the surface. You taught us that everyone has a story worth respecting." As Sarah prepared for another day of missions, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. From military pilot to mall security guard, to chief pilot of a medical evacuation service, each phase had prepared her for the next. The humiliation she had endured had taught her empathy. The kindness she had shown to others had reinforced her values. The courage she had found to return to flying had restored her sense of purpose, but most importantly, she had learned that heroism wasn't about the uniform you wore or the recognition you received. It was about the choice to serve others, whether anyone was watching or not. The mall security guard who had been mocked by teenagers had always been a hero. It had just taken the right circumstances for that heroism to be recognized. By the time Desert Sky Aviation celebrated its first anniversary, Sarah had built the medical evacuation service into one of the most respected programs in the Southwest. The company now operated 5 helicopters and had completed over 400 successful missions. saving lives across Arizona and New Mexico's most remote areas. The success had brought Sarah recognition from the aviation industry, the medical community, and veteran organizations across the country. She had been named Aviation Professional of the Year by the National EMS Pilots Association, and her story had been featured in numerous professional journals and magazines. But the recognition that meant the most to Sarah came from an unexpected source. The Phoenix Children's Hospital had named their new trauma helicopter Sarah's Hope in honor of her service and her story of redemption. The dedication ceremony had been attended by hundreds of people, including many of the patients, whose lives had been saved by Sarah's flights. This helicopter will carry forward the same spirit of service and dedication that Captain Chen demonstrated during her remarkable career, the hospital president had said during the ceremony. It will serve as a reminder that heroes come in all forms, and that sometimes the most important service happens when nobody is watching. Emma, now 16, had been in the audience that day, watching her mother with obvious pride. Their relationship had grown stronger with each passing month, and Emma had become an accomplished student pilot herself, training for her private pilot's license while maintaining excellent grades in school. "Mom, I used to be embarrassed when kids at school found out you worked mall security," Emma had confided after the ceremony. "But now I realize how wrong I was. You were always a hero. I just didn't understand that heroism isn't about the uniform you wear or the job you have. It's about the choices you make when someone needs help." The teenagers from the mall had also continued to flourish. Jake was now a cadet at the Air Force Academy, excelling in his studies and preparing for a career as a military pilot. He had written to Sarah regularly, sharing his experiences and thanking her for the example she had set. Madison had completed her documentary about veteran employment issues, and it had been accepted to several film festivals. She was now studying journalism at Arizona State University, with plans to continue highlighting stories of resilience and redemption. Tyler had earned his private pilot's license and was working as a volunteer pilot for the Civil Air Patrol, conducting search and rescue missions in the Arizona wilderness. His transformation from a cynical teenager to a dedicated public servant had been remarkable to witness. Alex had been accepted to medical school at the University of Arizona, where he was planning to specialize in emergency medicine. He had credited Sarah with inspiring him to pursue a career dedicated to helping others in their most vulnerable moments. Their collective transformation had become a powerful part of Sarah's story, demonstrating that positive role models could inspire change. In even the most unlikely circumstances, they had appeared together on several national television programs, discussing the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and the power of second chances. The relationship between Sarah and Marcus had also continued to develop. They had married in a small ceremony at the Desert Sky hangar, surrounded by their colleagues, friends, and family. The marriage had been a celebration not just of their love for each other, but of their shared commitment to serving others through aviation. "You know," Marcus had said during his wedding speech, "I first met Sarah in a combat zone, where she was already a legend among the pilots. Then I reconnected with her at a shopping mall, where she was working security and being dismissed by people who couldn't see past her current circumstances. But Sarah was the same person in both places, someone dedicated to serving others, whether she was flying combat missions or helping an elderly woman with a car lockout." The speech had captured something essential about Sarah's character, that her identity as a servant of others had remained constant even when her circumstances had changed dramatically. One of the most meaningful moments of the past year had come when Sarah received a letter from Robert Martinez, the elderly veteran who had suffered a heart attack during the Heroes' Day event at the mall. He had made a full recovery and had written to thank her for the compassion she had shown him during his medical emergency. "You probably don't remember me," he wrote, "but you helped me when I collapsed in the mall parking lot. You kept me calm and comfortable until the paramedics arrived." At the time, I thought you were just a security guard doing her job. Now I know you were a decorated war hero who treated an old veteran with the same dignity and respect you showed to everyone else. That's the kind of person who deserves to be called a hero." Sarah had framed the letter and hung it in her office, a reminder that every act of service mattered, regardless of the circumstances or the recognition it received. As Sarah prepared for another day of missions, she reflected on the circular nature of her journey. She had started as a confident military pilot, then humbled by injury and circumstance, found dignity in humble service, and ultimately returned to meaningful aviation work with a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve others. The mall security guard who had been mocked by teenagers had become a nationally recognized figure. But more importantly, she had become a symbol of resilience and the power of perseverance. Her story had shown that setbacks weren't permanent, that every person had value regardless of their circumstances, and that heroes came in all forms. Standing in the desert sky hangar, surrounded by the helicopters that carried her team on life-saving missions every day, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this point. The mockery, the struggle, the moments of doubt, all of it had been necessary to prepare her for this moment, when she could use her gifts to serve others in the most meaningful way possible. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, and new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, Sarah Chen, mall security guard, decorated veteran, and chief pilot, was exactly where she belonged. 1 year after the medical center rescue, Sarah stood at the podium of the National Veterans Convention in Washington, D.C., delivering the keynote address to an audience of thousands. Her story had become a symbol of resilience and redemption, inspiring veterans across the country to persevere through their own challenges and find new ways to serve their communities. "When I was working mall security," Sarah said to the audience, "I thought my story was over. I thought I had been reduced to the sum of my limitations rather than the total of my experiences. But what I learned was that every phase of our lives has value, and every person we encounter has something to teach us." In the audience, Sarah could see familiar faces. Emma was there with Marcus, both beaming with pride. The 4 teenagers now. Young adults had traveled from Arizona to hear her speak. Jake was in his 2nd year at the Air Force Academy. Madison was working as a journalist covering veterans issues. Tyler had joined the Coast Guard. And Alex was in his 3rd year of medical school. Also in the audience were Mrs. Dorothy Hendricks, who had become a regular correspondent and supporter of Sarah's work, and Dr. Jennifer Martinez, who had established a scholarship fund for veterans pursuing careers in healthcare. "The teenagers who used to mock me at the mall taught me one of the most important lessons of my life," Sarah continued. "They showed me that we all have preconceptions about people based on their circumstances, and that true growth comes from challenging those assumptions. They learned to see beyond my uniform to my character, and I learned to see beyond their behavior to their potential." Sarah paused, looking out at the sea of faces before her. "Today, I want to challenge each of you to look at your own life differently. If you're struggling with the transition from military to civilian life, remember that your service has given you skills and values that the world needs. If you're working in a job that doesn't match your qualifications, remember that excellence is a choice you make every day regardless of your title." She gestured toward the teenagers in the audience. "These young people taught me that redemption is possible, that people can change, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply show up and do your job with dignity and compassion." After her speech, Sarah was approached by a young veteran who had been struggling with PTSD and unemployment. "Captain Chun," he said, "I've been feeling like my life is over, like I don't have anything to offer anymore. Your story gives me hope that things can get better." Sarah shook his hand and looked him in the eye. "Your life is far from over. You've served your country with honor, and that service has given you skills and strength that you may not even realize you have. The key is to find ways to use those gifts to serve others, even in small ways. Start where you are, with what you have, and trust that purpose will reveal itself. As the convention concluded, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a confident military pilot, been humbled by injury and circumstance, found dignity in humble service, and ultimately returned to her calling with a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve others. The medical evacuation service she now led had saved hundreds of lives, and she had trained dozens of pilots who were carrying on the mission of serving others through aviation. Emma was thriving in her studies and preparing for her own military service. Her relationship with Marcus had grown into a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had learned that heroism wasn't about the uniform you wore or the title you held. It was about the choices you made when faced with challenges. It was about treating every person with respect, regardless of their circumstances. It was about finding meaning in whatever work you were doing and looking for ways to make a positive impact on the lives of others. The teenagers who had once mocked her for being just a mall security guard had learned the same lesson. They had discovered that true strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down, and that the adults around them were not obstacles to overcome, but potential mentors and allies. As Sarah boarded her flight back to Arizona, she thought about the next phase of her journey. She had been offered a position developing aviation programs for veteran training initiatives, and she was considering writing a book about her experiences. Whatever the future held, she knew that her purpose was to continue serving others and to help people discover their own potential for greatness. The mall security guard, who had been mocked and dismissed, had become a national symbol of perseverance and service. But more importantly, she had become a reminder that every person has a story, every job has dignity, and every individual has the potential to make a difference in the world. Sarah's story had come full circle, from the heights of military service to the depths of personal struggle to the satisfaction of meaningful civilian service. Along the way, she had learned that true heroism wasn't about the moments when everyone was watching. It was about the daily choices to show up, do your job with excellence, and treat every person you encountered with respect and compassion. The helicopter that had carried her back to her calling was more than just a machine. It was a symbol of the dreams that survive even the darkest times, the skills that endure beyond setbacks, and the purpose that calls us to serve something greater than ourselves. As the plane lifted off from Washington, D.C., Sarah smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve, new challenges to overcome, and new people to inspire. The girl who had once been mocked for wearing the security guard's uniform had shown the world that true strength comes not from what people think of you, but from what you choose to do when others need your help. And somewhere in a mall in Arizona, a new security guard was beginning their own journey, carrying themselves with quiet dignity and professional competence, never knowing that their story too might someday inspire others to look beyond the uniform to see the hero within. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.